people who rely on the historical abuse by officials, saying the looser standards were historically extremely problematic. Jeffrey Stone is probably one of the bigger people in that area. Or people who have expressed concern that efforts to alter Brandenburg will be used to punish dissent. So there has certainly been a lot said on both sides. I think those concerns about altering Brandenburg are very real. They are as real as the potential dangers that are posed by terror speech that people are already concerned about. One of the things to note that I think didn't get said explicitly, but I do think that we do need to talk about, is the concern for unpopular speakers that also underlies the Brandenburg Standard. That lesser standard, the clear and present danger standard, as it was evolving, when it was used by government officials in the period from World War I through the Red Scare, through the Communist era, and even through the 1960s, was used largely against very unpopular groups, people who were unpopular within the American polity. So communists, socialists, and domestic groups that the FBI, specifically probably J. Edgar Hoover, thought were subversive, right? So student organizations in the 50s and 60s. So one of the things that is part of the history and evolution of Brandenburg is the fact that people recognize that it was used against largely groups that were unpopular and critical of the government, not necessarily mainstream groups. Right, so loosening that standard in the case, well, that's part of what we're dealing with. I'm going to place myself pretty firmly in the camp of people who are somewhat skeptical of loosening Brandenburg. I will say that, which is not to say I think that speech can't be punished, but that this may not be the way to go about doing it, partly because of this history, but also because of a notion that I want to talk about, which is complementary to that, which is what do we mean when we talk about terrorism? All right, so that was actually the last question from the last panel, and I wanted to lean over and say, hey, that's my talk, so here we are. The interesting thing about the debate, that as we've had it so far, is that largely everyone seems to agree, whether they agree on changing Brandenburg or not, largely everyone seems to agree that the terrorism we're talking about is international jihadist terrorism. Right, that debate has proceeded pretty much along those lines. We're talking about ISIS or Al-Qaeda or groups along those lines. Now, I honestly don't know whether this is on purpose or because it's simply the way the debate was originally framed by the people who had proposed the original changes to Brandenburg, or partly because of the decision in Humanitarian Law Project and the litigation revolving around that, which focused on the provision in U.S. law about giving material support to designated foreign terrorist organizations. Right? So it may just be that that's simply what was on everyone's radar screen. But it's unquestionably the case that the debate has proceeded along the lines of the assumption that foreign terrorist organizations present a harm that is so exceptional that it possibly warrants a change in the rules. And the debate has, since that's been the starting point, and we've said yes or no, depending on that assumption. So what bothers me about that debate is the general failure to examine the assumption about what we mean by terrorism and the possible consequences of what that failure means. Right? So if we begin proposing changing the law or changing the law based on an unspoken and unexamined notion of terrorism, what could possibly happen? Right? So terrorism is not an activity that is easy to define. I mean, it's easy to define, it's just not susceptible of a definition that everyone will agree on. Right? As early as the 1970s, when international terrorism really came onto the world screen or the world stage, experts noted that the definition of terrorism seems to depend on point of view. It is what the bad guys do, and that is a direct quote. So if you have a debate based on an assumption of who the bad guys are without carefully examining the nature of the concepts that you're using, I think you risk injecting an arbitrariness into the application of the law that may undermine the reasons for Brandenburg's existence. Right, so I'm going to give you two examples that are really different at very opposite ends of the spectrum, but they are an example of how arbitrariness can occur. The first one involves the fact that just assuming that terrorism involves international jihadist terrorism ignores domestic populations that could easily fit within that definition. And what that means for regulation of speech can be very powerful. All right, so common definitions of domestic terrorism include, just for example, if you look at, especially since people have started examining this issue somewhat, the Congressional Research Service did a pretty big report on this and said, the most common definition, if you were to just look at it, would be Americans who commit ideological driven crimes in the United States but lack foreign direction or influence. So that's a very basic definition, but it's just an ideological driven crime that doesn't have an outside influence. Right? The Code of Federal Regulations also has a definition of domestic terrorism, which is the unlawful use of force and violence against persons or property to intimidate or coerce a government, the civilian population, or any segment thereof in furtherance of political or social objectives. Not all that different from the common definition in the CRS report, a little bit more specific, right, but essentially akin to it. The U.S. Code, part of the sort of whole series of laws that Humanitarian Law Project was based on, has a somewhat more specific definition that has predicate crimes that would be the terrorist crimes that you would have to be charged with in order to fall within the actual criminal law. But it's a little bit more specific, but it's essentially similar. And the only thing that differentiates domestic terrorism from foreign terrorism is the fact that there is no foreign influence. Right, so there's a lot of similarity between the definitions, and yet we don't tend to, in this debate, talk about the fact that there are a number of domestic organizations that could fall within these definitions. Right, so Carolyn Corbin, who's my co-author on another issue, has been a notable exception to this debate and has noted that, in an article that I think is in the Fordham Law Review, actually, which is wonderfully titled, actually, Terrorists Are Always Brown and Black and Never White, that the tendency to equate terrorism with jihadist terrorism often creates a blind spot regarding white nationalist or Christian nationalist organizations whose activities could easily fall within the above definitions. And her point is that this can really actually have an impact on our security here in the United States. So not only are the actions of some of these groups similar to jihadist organizations, for example, there is violence. Charlottesville would potentially be a good example of that. But these organizations also use social media, for example, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, in much the same way that jihadist organizations do to reach receptive audiences. But we rarely discuss the speech of these organizations in terms of terrorism. Right? We don't talk about the fact that we should change our regulation or our understanding of Brandenburg because those organizations and their speech pose such an outsized danger to national security or to our security generally, even though we could talk about much of their speech as propaganda, indoctrination, or encouragement to commit violence. Instead, what we do is we tend to talk about their speech as hate speech. We focus on it in that context instead of terrorism-related speech. And most of the scholars and legal experts tend to agree that hate speech is not something that we can regulate easily and if it falls outside of the other low-value speech categories like threats, intimidation, fighting words. Right? And so there's a strong debate about whether we should regulate hate speech, and that's been certainly reanimated in the last couple of years. But what we tend to do is talk about whether private actors should regulate hate speech, whether we should deplatform people from social media as a result of hate speech. And I do think that the framing of this issue matters, right? So the question with white nationalist organizations tends to be whether private organizations engage in censorship when they deplatform. I mean, there's a huge issue about social media and whether social media organizations should be allowed to regulate hate speech because they're essentially like state actors. Right? And so we aren't talking about so much changing the law, though there are those debates, but about whether that even private actors not subject to the First Amendment should be allowed to regulate that speech. Right? But the question with international terrorism in this debate that I'm talking about is whether we should actually change Brandenburg because of the outsized danger that their terrorist organizations' free speech poses, but those terrorist organizations are usually jihadist organizations. So the fact that we have such wildly different frames for what is often seriously overlapping activity and related speech, I think should give us pause as to whether terrorism is the right vehicle or frame with which we should be discussing this kind of dangerous speech. If we think it's dangerous, maybe we should be talking about what other tools are available to us. So that's one potential arbitrary factor. The other one as I said, is kind of in the opposite end of the spectrum. So the above discussion notes that the narrow definition of terrorism sort of has a blind spot with respect to certain groups and is arbitrary in its application because it's under-inclusive in its interpretation of terrorism, while the opposite can also be true. Right? You can have these definitions of terrorism be wildly over-inclusive as well, and so government officials can vastly overreach with their use of the definition. So the debate's assumptions about the exceptional nature of jihadist terrorism imply that changes in the law are justified because they will be applied only in the most exceptional of circumstances, right? This is this outsized harm, and I don't want to diminish the nature of the harm, but that it's just an exceptional harm that justifies this change because we don't know how to deal with it otherwise. But the above definitions that I gave you should tell you that the definition of terrorism is actually much broader than that, right? It's fairly malleable. It certainly could be applied much more broadly and manipulated and used against anyone that we think of as the bad guys, as that one expert in the 1970s observed. An ideologically driven crime or a crime against person and property intended to coerce the government could include a whole host of crimes involved by those who protest. Right? So if you've ever seen a big protest and you see what can happen, there are all sorts of property crimes that occur. Sometimes they occur on purpose, right? Because people are actually engaging in civil disobedience, right? So there are times when the definition of terrorism could easily be used for anybody who is protesting for a cause, because that's ideologically driven. So increasingly, especially when you think of things like the pipeline protests, for example, you can see a lot of ideologically driven protests that could fall within this definition. And several people have raised concerns, especially in the last couple of years, that law enforcement officials are using the language labeling protesters as extremists or domestic terrorists, and they have used the phrase domestic terrorists, against activists who are critical of government actions. And I think that's really important, that what the activists are usually being fairly critical of how the government is handling something. So the Black Lives Matter movement is a good example. We saw that earlier this morning. I saw a report just 2 days ago that suggested that they were concerned that the people in the Black Lives Matter movement were actually potentially related to international terrorists. So you can actually bridge that gap if you want to. There was no evidence that that was the case, but that is sometimes where we go. Antifa, which does have its own issues with violence, but that is a group that, especially pre-Charlottesville, the government seemed to be somewhat more worried about at times, and that was part of the problem. The Dakota pipeline protesters and activists, I'm almost done, activists protesting the U.S., the migrant situation at the U.S. Mexico border. There's evidence, for example, that people who have been protesting have been surveilled and stopped and harassed because they've been deemed to be not engaging in legitimate protests, but in activities that are somehow a threat to security. All right. So that issue, I think, is an important one. Though the proposed changes by advocates of changing Brandenburg in the debate, I think, are spurred by legitimate concerns about danger coming from international terrorism. I think you have to question whether that concept, that background norm, is really going to limit in any way any change that actually occurs. Once you change the law in a way that can apply to any notion of terrorism, those notions are so broad, and I think government officials use what tools are available to them because they're trying to fight whatever they see as, an impediment or a possible problem. I think you have real issues there. So,
thank you very much, David.
So first off, I'd like to thank all the symposium organizers for inviting me to participate in this really wonderful symposium. The subject of this panel is free speech, incitement, and terrorist anxiety. And as Chris sort of mentioned, I think that this all kind of implies a basic question, right? So is there something different or exceptional about present-day terrorism that warrants some sort of broad reevaluation of the Brandenburg Standard. And in thinking about this question, I want to focus on what I'll call terrorist advocacy. So this is just abstract advocacy of sort of lawless terroristic conduct, and that's fully protected speech, really, under current First Amendment jurisprudence. Is there any basis to argue today that some sort of doctrinal adjustment's warranted, right, such that the government should have greater freedom to regulate such speech? And I'm going to focus on what has been a sort of popular argument for reconsidering the incitement standard with respect to terrorist advocacy, right? So this is the fundamental technological changes that have occurred in the intervening 50 years since Brandenburg, so in particular, the emergence of the internet and social media. So there will be some overlap with what we heard in the last panel. This line of argument, I think, raises a sort of fundamental question regarding the nature of the Brandenburg Standard. So to what extent should we conceptualize the standard in purely instrumental terms, right? So as simply kind of capturing an optimal balance between free speech and state regulatory interests. And by contrast, to what extent should it be conceptualized as sort of inextricably tied to foundational principles that are just essential to any meaningful conception of free speech? And there are, I think, some interesting parallels here between this question and the Fourth Amendment issue that the court recently confronted in Carpenter v. United States. And I think our intuitions regarding the answer to this question are going to ultimately reflect how comfortable we might be with sort of recalibrating incitement doctrine in light of intervening technological changes. So I want to start things off with an example of the sort of abstract terrorist advocacy that I have in mind. Right? So dozens of the terrorist attacks in the late 2000s and the early 2010s, both in the United States and around the world, all shared a common characteristic. So the attackers were strongly influenced to undertake such action by sort of various online media that was produced by the radical cleric Anwar al-Awlaki. Now, even after al-Awlaki's death in 2011, his online lectures and tracts were identified as a major influence on, for example, Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, the Boston Marathon bomber, the San Bernardino attackers, and Omar Mateen, who was the Orlando nightclub shooter. Now, for the most part, he wasn't inciting people to commit these specific acts or helping plan them out, and many of these attacks occurred after his death. Rather, the standard narrative, as we've heard, is that the attackers were radicalized by his broad and abstract exhortations for true believers to go to war with the United States and other Western countries. So, if we classify it, al-Awlaki's speech is ultimately, abstract advocacy of lawless action at some indefinite future time, right? And that, of course, clearly falls outside of Brandenburg, and thus is fully protected by the First Amendment. So what is it about terrorist advocacy today that might perhaps justify some sort of broad reevaluation of the Brandenburg Standard? Now, I'm going to set aside, for present purposes, any sort of broad arguments premised on some sort of national security exceptionalism, right? The idea that in moments of national crisis, like wartime, the government should just have greater latitude to regulate advocacy of lawless action. There's a sort of long-standing, continuously recurring debate within this area of incitement. I'm sort of not going to delve into that for present purposes. But in recent years, as Chris discussed, so Cass Sunstein and Eric Posner, they both sort of argued for limitations on the First Amendment's protection of terrorist advocacy based on the sorts of revolutionary technological changes that have taken place in the 50 years since Brandenburg was decided, so specifically the advent of the internet and social media. Now, before delving into this argument, I want to take a brief detour to discuss a recent case from a completely different constitutional context, and this is the Supreme Court's recent Fourth Amendment decision in Carpenter v. United States. I think Carpenter helps us sort of conceptualize the basic framework for how technological change sort of interacts with constitutional rights doctrine in situations like this. So in Carpenter, the police, without a warrant, collected and used historical cell site location information, or CSLI, to prove that the defendant was at the scene of multiple robberies. CSLI, this is basically the location data that's collected automatically by like cell phones pinging nearby cell towers whenever they're on. Now, at least on their face, pre-existing doctrinal principles seem to dictate the result here, right? So the court had previously articulated the so-called third-party doctrine. This is the broad principle that people have no legitimate expectation of privacy in information that they voluntarily turn over to third parties. And the court had applied this in cases dealing with the acquisition of bank records and pen registers, which is a log of the outgoing phone calls made from a landline. The court had also previously held that a person traveling on public thoroughfares doesn't have a reasonable expectation of privacy in their movements, since obviously anyone could sort of see them or follow them. And this was articulated in a case where the police used a sort of crude tracking beeper to follow a person's car. So it seems like, anyone using a cell phone is voluntarily conveying CSLI to the wireless provider, just like anyone using a landline is voluntarily conveying the numbers they're dialing to the phone company. And to the extent CSLI data is being used to track the person's movement on public thoroughfares, they can't be deemed to have a reasonable expectation of privacy. But of course, we no longer live in a world of crude tracking beepers, right? We live in a world of like GPS and CSLI tracking. And with this technology, the government can intrude into private lives far more cheaply and extensively. The tracking is relatively costless. It's fully automated, unlike following somebody in a police car with a beeper detector in your hand. And the information provided is exhaustive, right? It's an extremely accurate record of a person's physical whereabouts for a massive period of time, right? So well beyond the limited information available from bank records or pen registers. So what's the court to do given this sort of technological change? So one option is to conceptualize the existing doctrine as sort of instrumental in nature. It's fashioned to capture a sort of pre-established optimal equilibrium between individual rights and state interests. So this is what Oren Kerr has called an equilibrium adjustment approach to Fourth Amendment doctrine, right? The idea that as technology evolves and throws off this kind of optimal equilibrium, the doctrine should be adjusted to reestablish it. And that's basically how the Carpenter Court framed and decided the case. It declined to extend the third-party doctrine to CSLI records. It deemed the police actions unconstitutional. So in this conflict between changed technological conditions and established doctrinal principles, here the third-party doctrine, it's the principles that yielded. So in effect, the court sort of viewed the third-party doctrine as just kind of a shorthand for a particular balancing judgment that was calibrated for a specific set of technological conditions. It's doctrine for a world of beepers and pen registers rather than GPS and CSLI tracking. So when technology alters that equilibrium, the court can adjust the doctrine to recapture it. But of course, the court could have gone the other way, right? It could have characterized the third-party doctrine as a sort of core foundational principle that's fundamentally tied to the nature of the right itself, one that has to continue to apply regardless of any shifts in the equilibrium sort of caused by technological change. And that's essentially what Justice Kennedy argued in his dissent. Maybe it's simply nonsensical to say that anyone can retain a reasonable expectation of privacy in information that's shared with third parties. So maybe any change in the equilibrium would be irrelevant, since recognizing a reasonable expectation of privacy in this situation would fundamentally contradict any meaningful conception of privacy. So now let's turn back to the question at hand, right? So Brandenburg, as we've all been discussing, is famously narrow and speech protective. So again, to go through the standard again, government cannot forbid or prescribe advocacy of the use of force or of law violation, except where such advocacy is directed to inciting or producing imminent lawless action and is likely to incite or produce such action. All right. Now, One way of reading the Brandenburg test is as the Carpenter Court treated the third-party doctrine, right? As shorthand for some sort of optimal instrumental equilibrium between the value of unfettered speech and the government's interest in regulating the harms of such speech. And if we look at it that way, perhaps there's an argument that the test is ripe for equilibrium adjustment. So Brandenburg was decided back in 1969, right? This is a world where the paradigmatic instances of dangerous advocacy were like public rallies or the distribution of leaflets, and these are methods of disseminating speech that are by nature highly constrained by physical limitations. So maybe the narrow Brandenburg test was the product of a pragmatic judgment that the value of unfettered speech falling short of incitement, or falling short of the incitement standard as defined in Brandenburg, trumps the likelihood and degree of harm caused by such speech within this technological context. Now, to be sure, speech falling short of the incitement standard might still cause riots or vandalism or other illegal acts, but maybe the court effectively concluded that when the incitement standard isn't met, the probability and magnitude of that harm is generally insufficient to trump the broad benefits associated with people's ability to speak freely. Now, if viewed in this manner, there's a reasonable argument that the calculus today is fundamentally different given the rise of the internet and social media, and this is sort of the basis for Sunstein's and Posner's arguments. So first, the internet means that dangerous advocacy can instantly be communicated to millions of people around the world, rather than, say, the few hundred people who happen to show up at your rally, right? So in purely instrumental terms, if we assume that dangerous advocacy will generally produce an X% chance that a listener will undertake harmful action as a result, then the capacity to disseminate that advocacy to millions rather than hundreds of people would, of course, multiply the likelihood of such resultant harmful action accordingly. Now, second, I think Rachel talked about this a little bit in the last panel, many have argued that the widespread proliferation of social media has sort of led to this creation of these online echo chambers, right? These virtual communities where people sort of insulate themselves in a cocoon of like-minded people and news sources and commentary. And within these echo chambers, it may be far less likely that dangerous advocacy will be neutralized by counter-speech, and in fact, that advocacy may be far more likely to blossom into harmful action as it'll be continuously reinforced by similar advocacy within that echo chamber. So in other words, if in 1969, the likelihood that harmful action would result from dangerous advocacy was X%, maybe that likelihood is now 5X%, given the operation of online echo chambers and the particular ways in which people today typically receive their news and commentary. So as Sunstein and Posner have argued, maybe some wholesale rebalancing of the onerous Brandenburg standard is necessary given this radical shift in the existing equilibrium that's been wrought by modern technology. And sort of under this view, Brandenburg basically presents a problem of doctrinal obsolescence, right? The incitement test was crafted to capture the optimal balance between free speech and the government's regulatory interests based on the world as it existed in 1969. But of course, we no longer live in a world of rallies and leaflets and the sort of physical limitations on the widespread dissemination of speech that these entail. So maybe to retain the same standard is to perpetuate an obsolete doctrinal framework, right? One that just doesn't sensibly fit the world that we currently inhabit. So this all seems to be pretty straightforward because it kind of directly tracks the approach that the court took in Carpenter, right? Constitutional doctrine ultimately reflects the particular technological context in which it was crafted. So when technology drastically alters the pre-existing equilibrium captured by the doctrine, the court should step in to revise it. But I think this conception of Brandenburg produces some discomfort, right? One that seems stronger than the discomfort one might have in the Carpenter context. And that's because I think there is this strong sense that the Brandenburg standard does not represent some sort of instrumental balance, but rather captures a sort of fundamental principle that's essential to the very notion of free speech. And indeed, the Brandenburg Court itself appeared to characterize its test as, in essence, sort of operationalizing what David Strauss has called the persuasion principle, right? The idea that the government cannot restrict speech because it fears that the speech will persuade the listener to do something that the government disapproves of, right? And this principle, finds ample support in the primary theoretical justifications for the protection of free speech. So promoting democratic self-governance, pursuit of truth, individual autonomy. So if we view it in this way, the narrowness of the Brandenburg test reflects the court's recognition of the persuasion principle as a fundamental aspect of free speech. So its requirements reflect the court's attempt to isolate speech that produces harm through a mechanism other than persuasion. So here, by targeting the sort of harmful speech that relies upon short-circuiting persuasion and deliberation in favor of emotion and instinct. So under this view, even if technological change has drastically multiplied the social harms caused by dangerous advocacy, any attempt to extend the reach of government regulation to cover such advocacy is really an attempt to cross a chasm that simply cannot be crossed, at least under any meaningful conception of free speech. So what then is the best way to conceptualize Brandenburg? And as an initial matter, I don't think either approach is sort of formally foreclosed by the Brandenburg decision itself. Although the Brandenburg court appeared to frame the test as a matter of sort of fundamental principle rather than as an instrumental balance, it of course never confronted the very different technological context of today, one in which the potential harms caused by dangerous advocacy may be far greater as compared to the sort of rally and leaflet world of 1969. Perhaps the Brandenburg court would have crafted a very different doctrinal standard that better reflects these very different conditions. Or maybe the court would have crafted the exact same standard under the rationale that fundamental First Amendment principles require us to absorb even this significantly greater degree of harm caused by dangerous advocacy. Now, where one ultimately comes out on this question is likely based on a variety of factors, right? Like one's general predilection for conceptualizing the First Amendment in instrumental terms rather than deontological terms or vice versa, one's broad judgments regarding various difficult to prove empirical questions like are online echo chambers really all that dangerous? I would say more sympathetic to the view that the Brandenburg standard should be retained. In the end, I do think that the persuasion principle is fundamental to the concept of free speech in a way that the third-party doctrine is not with respect to Fourth Amendment privacy. But that being said, I think it's a sort of drastic oversimplification to think of this as sort of a purely binary question, right? So adopting either a purely instrumental view of the existing doctrine on the one hand and a sort of purely absolute principle view on the other merely represents sort of extremes on either side of a spectrum, right? The more precise question is where courts fall or should fall along that spectrum. Even the most foundational principles within constitutional rights jurisprudence have their practical limits. After all, that's why the court has installed strict scrutiny within constitutional rights doctrine, since the strict scrutiny standard effectively acts as a sort of safety valve to account for those very highly exceptional circumstances within which even core constitutional rights must yield. So even those who may prefer a sort of more principle-based reading of the Brandenburg standard have to acknowledge that some limits to this principle likely exist, right? So if, for example, technological and social conditions were such that 50,000 lives were being lost every year due to terrorist acts directly caused by dangerous internet advocacy, I'd say even the most speech-friendly courts would be hard-pressed to deny the government the ability to regulate such speech directly. So in the end, I think where one stands on this issue may rest not only on one sort of preferred theoretical view of how First Amendment protection should be conceptualized, but also on one's judgments as to whether, given the current technological context, the actual and potential harm produced by dangerous advocacy is just so severe as to reach this kind of breaking point justifying direct government regulation. So I think I'll stop there. Thanks so much. I look forward to your questions and comments.
Leslie?
right. Here. Okay, thank you so much. And like all of the other panelists, I'm so happy to be here, and thank you so much for inviting me. Thanks to the school and to everyone who I know was behind this, either visible or invisible. I appreciate it. So, let's see. My topic is incitement light. Okay? And my theme is that the incitement exclusion, as we know it, and are talking about it today, developed in the public speech, criminal punishment, gone from public discussion entirely context. And so whether or not that exclusion should be modified or stay the same, it has grown into a big gorilla that has burst out of its cage and is lumbering around, wreaking havoc, and taking up a bunch of space in places where it doesn't belong. And so my theme then, or the theory I'm going to be talking about, is indeed incitement. And by incitement, I do mean the theory that the government can restrict speech because its content persuades listeners to move beyond opinion change to engage in harmful conduct that the government can prohibit directly. And so the light part talks about adjusting the doctrine to fit different contexts of regulation. And so the three contexts that I'm going to be talking about are administration of non-public forums, secondary effects analysis, and tort liability for speech that provokes listeners to harm people. So I'll start with administration of non-public forums. And since the topic of this panel is terrorism, I'll start with that too. So here's incitement to terrorism, so they said, in a bus advertisement. Okay? And this is the American Freedom Defense Fund, a pro-Israel advocacy organization, proposed to put this ad on New York City buses. So if you can read it, Killing Jews is Worship, that draws us close to Allah, and it's Hamas TV, that's his jihad, what's yours? And then there is a disclaimer, it's the AFDF that's sponsoring it. So transit advertising is some type of forum within the court's forum doctrine. The government creates a forum when it invites outside speakers onto its property. The particular boundaries, as you folks may well know, within forum doctrine are wildly unclear. But what is clear is that non-public forums, as I'm going to define the universe today, are essentially different from public forums, like parks and streets, which the government must hold open for public citizen-to-citizen speech. So a public forum is open and external, and strict free speech rules apply. But a non-public forum is limited and internal to the operations of a particular government enterprise. So examples of non-public forums include military authorities managing outside speakers they invite onto the base, a school board operating an internal mail system, inviting some outside speakers, a United States Post Office branch managing private speech activities on the sidewalk entry to its building, and a city transit agency, like the New York MTA, managing advertising on the inside of its buses. Okay? Caveat here, external advertising, like on the outside of buses, presents doctrinal complications. So we're going to assume, for my talk today, that this AFDF ad was going to go inside the buses so that we're sure we've got a non-public forum as I'm defining it. So the government doesn't have to open a non-public forum to any outside speakers. If it chooses to do so, it can exclude speech that it predicts will cause listeners to react in ways that will disrupt its operations, so long as it acts reasonably and equally according to viewpoint. So there's a lot more discretion that non-public forum managers have than public forum managers have, and it's because non-public forum managers are also running an entirely separate business. Okay? So moving back to the proposed AFDF advertisement, MTA wanted to exclude this as incitement to violence. The incitement exclusion, I will say it one more time, requires that speech be directed to inciting or producing imminent lawless action and likely to incite or produce it. So here's what the Second Circuit Court of Appeals had to say about that one. Directed? Well, AFDI, the sponsor of the ad, certainly didn't subjectively intend to persuade viewers to attack Jews, right, as a pro-Israel organization. What about objective intent? Would reasonable viewers nevertheless interpret it that way? Well, the ad clearly attributes the words of action to Hamas TV, so reasonable viewers would not interpret the sponsor of the ad as advocating, much less inciting, anything. But what about a small set of radicalized Islamists who might interpret the words as a call to kill Jews? Response? If that group is as violent and radicalized as the MTA contends, presumably they would not need a bus advertisement to remind them of Hamas's interpretation of the Quran. All right, so likely, where's the evidence? The ad ran in other cities, no one reacted violently. But New Yorkers are different, because the ad that prompted the Killing Jews ad didn't run in their city, so they won't understand it's a parody. Nope. But New York's different, because as a city, it is a unique target of terrorism. Yes, it is, but so what? The focus of the incitement exclusion is on the speech within the four corners of the advertisements, not on a generalized, heightened potential for violent acts due to the city in which this might take place. Oh, and finally, imminent? No again. Ads are fleeting, New Yorkers are tolerant, and no evidence suggests that glimpsing this type of rhetoric while traveling is sufficient to trigger a violent reaction. So MTA loses. And not only that, MTA's claims of danger are made to look somewhat ridiculous, if not disingenuous. The bureaucrats enforcing the rules are overcautious, they don't protect speech enough, and they're out of touch. Alternatively, however, and more generously, the awkward effort to fit this within the incitement exclusion illustrates the lack of alternative or non-public forum managers that they perceive under existing public speech exclusion doctrine to exclude speech to avoid incitement of disruptive conduct that's short of lawbreaking. Maybe MTA was less concerned about incitement to terrorism than it was about incitement to fear or distrust of people who look like the man in the ad. The Constitution prohibits the government, as we know, from restricting hate speech because its message may offend viewers or provoke a hostile reaction. But maybe MTA was concerned about more than viewers sitting around feeling offended. Maybe it was concerned that viewers would be persuaded by the message of the speech and that those reactions could move from opinion change to conduct. The ad could persuade some viewers, MTA could think, to treat Muslim-looking drivers, employees, or passengers fearfully or distrustfully, and others who may fit the stereotype to behave as objects of fear and distrust. MTA could also reasonably predict this conduct of fear and distrust among employees and transit patrons would disrupt its operations by sowing discord among the participants and convincing employees or passengers they're not welcome and they should leave. So this speech persuasion conduct link is the same as the incitement category. The incitement category, however, as we know, with its narrow elements and particularly conduct limited to lawbreaking, seems to mark the limit of exclusions based upon the speech conduct link, because extending beyond those boundaries would be viewpoint discriminatory, which is prohibited everywhere. So outside the example of hate speech, which has its separate issues associated with it, the court's current broad sense of viewpoint discrimination seems to limit the ability of non-public forum managers, like MTA, to restrict even the most urgently inciting speech on the ground that listeners will react by engaging in conduct short of lawbreaking. So moving from the drama of terrorism to the more mundane, most transit authorities believe and have it by written policy that they're allowed to exclude advertising that tends to disparage the quality of service provided by the transit agency or by public transportation generally. Such policies would exclude recent advertisements comparing subway service to the better service available on Uber, right? Or Lyft. We would have held the door for you. Or this 2003 advertisement, my favorite, for used car financing. Can you see that? Only creeps and weirdos ride the bus? Okay. These advertisements are designed to persuade viewers to move from opinion change to conduct, and that conduct directly undercuts the money-making function of the forum and the public service function of the transit agency. So here's a question. Should transit agencies be able to exclude these types of advertisements directed, and again, internally to their employees and their patrons? Okay, if you're feeling squeamish about public transit and ads, should a school system be able to exclude send your kids to private school from the parent-to-parent advice section of its website, open to all parents? Should the post office be able to exclude use email rather than real mail flyers from its sidewalk entry that it opens to public issue advocacy groups? All of these actions would be viewpoint discriminatory and outside the incitement category. But here's a crucial point, the thing to notice, which is under the current viewpoint discrimination doctrine, the incitement category allows the government to discriminate on the basis of viewpoint. So if, as the court said recently, excluding demeaning speech is viewpoint discriminatory because it's viewpoint discriminatory as compared to tolerant speech, well then excluding speech inciting unlawful action is viewpoint discriminatory as compared to speech inciting lawful action. So the significance of non-public forum incitement light, as I'm proposing it, is that it would adjust the scope of viewpoint discrimination possible for non-public forum managers within the revised category to reflect the different scope of authority to regulate conduct and speech that non-public forum managers possess. The existing incitement category is limited to unlawful action, which mirrors the scope of the government as sovereign, its constitutional authority to control the conduct of citizens in the public realm directly. But non-public forum managers have the delegated authority to control the conduct of participants to prevent disruption of their operations. So a non-public forum exclusion that implements the same speech conduct link of the incitement category would allow managers to exclude speech that incites conduct that disrupts the operation of their enterprises, meaning the Uber, the Lyft, and certainly the creeps and weirdos ad. So I know. This is a very broad proposition and potentially prone to abuse. But once again, it permits viewpoint discrimination only under the same speech conduct theory as supports the public forum incitement exclusion. And so the other elements of incitement certainly in a revised category would need to be defined, and procedures and review would need to ensure that non-public forum managers don't discriminate according to viewpoint within the revised category. But I do want to say these things can be done and are done already in non-public forum / limited public forum review. And not allowing non-public forum managers a parallel scope of discretion to what the government as sovereign possesses to exclude speech that threatens their ability to perform their core delegated functions has adverse free speech consequences. Back to the MTA and the Killing Jews ad, AFDF won an injunction ordering MTA to run the ad. But did you see it? No. Because then instead of broadcasting the speech, MTA closed its advertising forum inside and outside all public transit to all public issue ads. Other transportation agencies in Philadelphia, Chicago, Seattle, and Washington, D.C. have done the same thing, limiting the outside speech they permit to commercial advertising. These agencies have lost millions of dollars in public issue advertising to support their operations, and a wide range of public issue groups can't present their ads. You know, the Alzheimer's Foundation, foundations telling kids to eat 4 fruits, if that's what you still say, they are not allowed to do it. And it's difficult to determine how many other non-public forums have been closed, modified, or not opened at all due to concern about challenges to their discretion to exclude at least some range of this type of speech. And, I happen to know one of them, which is my husband is general counsel at CalPERS, California Public Employees Retirement System. They've got 2,800 employees. And after he came on the job, he saw what was going on there, which was a number of different kind of randomly chosen or allowed groups being able to come and do presentations and do various things, and he shut it down. And this was before he knew I was writing about it. I found out afterwards. But it's because of concern. Number one, I would have to say, too, about the rules. They're just unclear. But number two, I thought that, you know, I'm not sure we have the discretion to do this, so we'll just shut the thing down. The Susan B. Komen Foundation was the one that most immediately got his axe. Okay, so how to avoid these results? Recognize some clearly defined scope of non-public forum incitement light. Next one, secondary effects. Bear with me here. In the context of regulation of sexually oriented businesses, incitement light explains a doctrine that's otherwise inexplicable. Courts apply what has become known as secondary effects analysis to analyze the constitutionality of zoning and other regulations of sexually oriented businesses. Erotic entertainment is protected by the free speech clause, and regulations targeting sexually oriented business look like they're content-based. And normally that would be subject to strict scrutiny review, but under secondary effects analysis, as the court calls it, only intermediate scrutiny applies to zoning and other regulations imposed upon those businesses. And the theory is it's because of the secondary effects, crime, blight, public health hazards occurring in and around the vicinity, and that those are secondary as opposed to direct listener reactions. But this isn't true. Patrons engage in many of the crimes and actions that cause public health harms as a result of being sexually stimulated by the conduct of these businesses, by the speech that these businesses are offering. And the other crimes and the blight that results occur because criminals are attracted to the premises, and we're assuming there's evidence of this, okay? But this is the theory. And the people who are then the patrons are the perfect victims for various reasons, but that's why the criminals are coming there and the crimes are occurring. So what we need to see is that these effects that the court is calling secondary actually trace, right, to listeners' reactions to the content of the expression and the conduct they're engaging in because of that. But the court just hasn't faced up to this link between the content of the regulated expression and secondary effects. And so secondary effects analysis is a deviation of the doctrine that needs to be explained somehow. So this is where incitement light comes in, meaning the incitement speech conduct link adjusted to the land use and zoning context. And I think it provides the best explanation for the court's intuition that intermediate rather than strict scrutiny should apply to review these regulations. These businesses supply speech that persuades viewers to move beyond intellectual responses to what? Physical or sexual stimulation, and patrons anticipating or reacting to this engage in conduct, predictable conduct, that the government has the power to regulate. The conduct the government can regulate is the so-called secondary effect. But it's really no more secondary, right, to the content of the speaker's message than is the conduct that justifies the incitement exclusion. Sympathetic listener conduct that's both likely and imminently provoked by the content of the speech justifies both the incitement exclusion and the secondary effects regulation. The difference between them is the level of speaker intent to persuade the listeners to engage in the conduct. So sexually oriented businesses, certainly they do intend to provoke sexual stimulation in the people who are viewing the speech, but they don't necessarily intend to provoke the move from that reaction to the speech into harmful conduct that the government can regulate. Nevertheless, it's evidence of that that justifies the regulation and makes it at least reasonable under secondary effects analysis. So what? The fact that they're going to move from reaction to conduct is at least foreseeable. Lower level of intent, but at least it's something. This degree of connection between speech sold by sexually oriented business and conduct doesn't support criminal punishment for the speech, but secondary effects analysis applies to differential treatment in zoning and other regulations that don't suppress the speech entirely. They're time, place, and manner regulations. So although the speech is outside public speech, highly protected, it's not impacted as much. So in sum, the lower level incitement speech conduct link, combined with a lesser impact on free speech exchange, creates the incitement light that best, I think, explains secondary effects analysis. Okay, finally, tort liability for speech that incites harmful conduct. Compensation of victims of torts committed by listeners urging or reacting to speech is another area ripe for incitement light. Unlike the first two examples, lots of people have noticed this and talked about it and written about it. So what I'm doing is just offering a few observations about it. So when we're talking about speech that contributes, the ways speech can contribute to harmful acts that cause tort, it could lead to tort liability, we talk about providing information that listeners can use to engage in harmful conduct, all sorts of examples, but, I missed I'm sorry, that's the secondary effects. There you go, cheetahs in San Diego. But here's our 3D gun, right? Publishing information on the internet about how to make a gun. Also, portraying speech that either inspires or people to be copycats or glorifies it. Example I've got here is Natural Born Killers, right? That was a number of years ago, right? Leads, again, unfortunately, to emulation and actual crimes. And then most modernly, as we're talking about the internet, creating interactive experiences where viewers then become confused about what's real and what isn't real. And so the example I've got here is Slender Man, which is a meme that, again, has inspired at least two, an attempted murder and then actual murder because the people were trying to please Slender Man. So the most common tort in this instance is negligence, okay? And often in these instances, you can't meet the tort elements. But the thing is, we don't know when you can meet the tort elements because the First Amendment steps in first and is usually the reason for decision. Okay, so the question is, should it be? That is, should it be a carte blanche for people who engage in any of these types of speech such that we don't know when we meet the tort foreseeability or other types of standards because we don't have to ask about it? And so people have offered solutions. The weight of opinion seems to be that there should be some sort of change in this area. And I'm going to agree with that. I don't know what it is, but indeed, in this age of the internet and social media and fake news and lots of harm that can be caused, it does seem like absolute immunity for this kind of speech based upon an incitement standard is just too much. And so then my second point that I'm going to make is that the proposals that have been offered for change mostly have all assumed that if a change is going to happen, it's going to change the category. Maybe it's a little bit broader, but the point is you fall into it or you fall out of it, right? So if you fall into the category, complete and total financial liability for the tort. If you fall out of it, then no liability whatsoever. And what I'd like to say is that, incitement light could possibly come in at the remedy stage as well. That is, maybe victims of incitement light torts, however we define them here, don't get fully compensated for their injuries. Maybe a statute, for example, defines the tort by identifying some factors that mark the speech that actually could stand a little bit of deterrence and maybe a little bit of chilling effect, and sets a damages cap, as with medical malpractice or other torts where competing social values come into play. And that cap could be very low, or it could depend upon the revenue generated by the speech or on other factors that adjust the deterrence and the chilling effect on speakers to protect the flow of valuable speech. And I should say here that when we're talking about this third example, this is fully protected public discourse, citizen-to-citizen speech. Okay, so this is unlike my other two examples where they each had something. They were in a different area, or it was only a time, place, and manner restriction. So you have to be very, very careful in this area, and that's why I'm saying maybe a little bit on the remedy. And so this type of midway remedy could include incentives also for speakers to do a little bit, right, to protect against having bad reactions happen to their speech from the speech that they give out. Figuring out how to structure this sort of incitement light remedy won't be easy, but coming up with good solutions to complex problems usually isn't. And so my point is that adjusting the remedy rather than defining another all or nothing category lowers the free speech stakes of experimenting with the doctrine, which may make it more palatable to courts that will review it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to open the floor for questions of the panelists. Yes.
Go all the way.
To just saying, let's just change our incitement doctrine altogether.
Oh,
So
and
for
not
example,
apply.
with the non-public forum. So, you know, the non-public-public forum distinction is a contingent product of recent free speech jurisprudence. There were plenty of justices on the court who thought that the line was much too firmly drawn. And to the extent that the justification is we want to allow the government to protect the core functions of its institutions, the doctrine that we have today goes way beyond that. It just sort of categorically distinguishes between deferential review when we come to non-public forums, although, as you point out, with limits, and the public forum. But a lot of the examples, like the MTA example, where what we're really worried about, and was very persuasive to me, that one of the things the MTA was worried about was that this is going to create discrimination and it's going to marginalize consumers of the MTA service. That doesn't really go to the, can the MTA continue to run its buses? Are we going to have fist fights on the MTA that are going to prevent the subway buses? That's the kind of concern we might think the government has when it regulates the public forum in general. So if you think that's the kind of forum, that's the kind of concern that the government may have when it's running subway buses, why not say, well, that's a legitimate state interest in all contexts? And then just on the second point with the secondary effects, that example is a really problematic one, I think, for you, because you assume that there's evidence of the claims that the court makes, but all the facts that we have about the cases is that there's these legislatures, when they enact these secondary effects laws, have no evidence. And in fact, if you look at the hearings and the facts that they rely upon when they make these often extreme, time, place, and manner laws, but extremely restrictive zoning laws, is they're motivated by two concerns. One is a concern about declining house prices or property values, because they think that it's not that so much that causes blight, that it's a sign that this is not a good, high-class neighborhood, and one can have some sympathy. A lot of this is, these are often communities that are trying to gentrify or trying to become respectable communities and are worried about the nudie bar that's really going to drive down property values. And two is a real dislike of the content of the speech and not wanting to have this kind of sexual speech in their neighborhood. And so you can see here how a lesser standard of scrutiny really allows what is, I think, quite clearly just the same old content discrimination, viewpoint discrimination that we are supposed to not allow under the Fifth Amendment.
Okay, yeah, I'll take the last one first because I remember it better. You know, I understand that my example depends upon there being evidence. And I understand that you could take the position, too, that there's simply not a way to avoid this type of viewpoint discrimination when the legislatures do it, that no matter what they say, you think they're biased. I'll go with that. But I do think that, nevertheless, the best explanation for the intuitions and for even the doctrine here is the lesser link that ties to the same link that justifies the incitement doctrine. And so I'd say we're talking about two separate things, because I am talking theoretically, let's assume there's the evidence, right? And all these guys who are going around and testifying and saying that, in fact, the criminals are attracted to these areas because of the perfect victim patrons, and it, in fact, does tie to the content of speech, right? So we have that incitement link. And then, and you're saying, I believe that the evidence really isn't there. And it's made up, and I know they rely upon it from all different jurisdictions. But I guess I view that as a separate thing, which is that all may be true. But nevertheless, if we take it as true, that would justify the doctrine, and that's what I was trying to say. I'm not saying they should. I'm explaining why the court has an intuition, how we could possibly have gotten to this weird place we are, which is secondary effects doctrine, which I understand everybody hates and thinks is stupid. So perhaps I shouldn't have even tried to justify it, because almost nobody will. But for some reason, I undertook that endeavor. And it struck me that this was the best explanation, an unarticulated kind of incitement-light link between what the businesses are doing and what the government is doing, and that it's particularly property land use specific, right? And that's what explains, too, why we've got it going on in that context as opposed to the complete protection, right, out on the internet and everything else about pornography or, you know, dial-up porn or all those sorts of things. And so that's where I am on that. And I'm willing to say that I understand that lots of people think that the evidence isn't there and is made up about these businesses actually having problems around them. Circling back to the number one, you remind me, just briefly.
Non-public forums, the concerns the NTA had, why they're legitimate everywhere.
Oh, why aren't they legitimate everywhere? Because I think that in the public forum and public speech, I developed this more in another piece, but the point is, well, particularly with that hate speech advertisement that I started with, I think and the reason why the big court's been talking about how, oh, the only harm from hate speech is offense, it's because in the public forum and in public speech and on the internet, what hate speech will lead to is opinion change, and an opinion change, if you treat people hatefully, it's not illegal, right? So the government actually can't regulate that. And so the difference I was trying to make in the non-public forum is that, in fact, the government has a greater scope of regulatory authority within, for example, a subway bus or a subway station, or within, and my workplace is the best example, right? They can impose a bunch of rules on workers and say, you know, you have to do this or you're fired. I mean, these are our rules here, which are different than what you could impose in public speech. And so I was trying to say that in the type of non-public forum, because it's got a greater scope of authority to control the conduct of participants directly, then that should lead to a broader scope of incitement, because you can incite conduct that's disruptive. And in the public forum, in a street or park, the only authority that the sovereign has is if that disruptive speech is actually illegal, then they can take action. But thanks for the questions. I did want to be challenged on this.
Do we have another question? Other questions? Yes, Bill.
Yeah, so I have a question both for David and one for Chris. So for David, it's really interesting comparison between Carpenter and Brandenburg. And I'm wondering whether you have any thoughts about how one goes about distinguishing between a constitutional principle and, for what, you know, for lack of a better term, is a doctrinal heuristic, right? I mean, it's sort of like a meta principle that helps us distinguish between the two. And for Chris, you know, your discussion of terrorism makes me ask what I suspect is the obvious question, maybe, which is, does the term terrorism do any work, or should it, or should we simply jettison the concept, or is it such a resonant concept in 2019 that we simply can't, you know, realistically think about excising the concept from our discussions?
So I'm a pragmatist about all these kinds of things, and I think it's all in the eye of the beholder to a significant extent, right? I mean, what's your theory of the First Amendment? No one can agree on what the theory of the First Amendment is, right? So it's going to vary what's interesting to me is, I mean, it's going to vary, I think, pretty much once you reach the extreme of we pragmatically have to say this is not protected. Everyone will sort of gradually get on board as you move towards that side of the spectrum. So to me, I don't know if I have a satisfying account of, like, when is something a principle, when is something sort of a deep. It's what you think is essential to each right? And that's going to vary greatly based on your own particular sort of philosophical, theoretical bent. Now, that being said, I think you can make plausible arguments that the First Amendment context is just completely different from the Fourth Amendment context, right? The Fourth Amendment textually is much more pragmatically structured, like unreasonable searches and seizures, right? So it sort of seems to account for the fact that let's be reasonable here and let's think about, so maybe if this rule just starts looking strange because of the changes that in technology, we can sort of jettison that and do something else. The First Amendment's more absolute on its terms, and there's more of a sense of once doctrine is set, we really feel like it should stay set. We don't want to think of it as sort of, you know, because of all these risks of government abuse, we don't want to think of it as kind of provisional in the sense of, you know, even when conditions change and maybe the balance is different, we like to think of it more in terms of these kinds of absolute principles that are impervious to these kinds of changes in technology. So I think practically speaking, it is in the eye of the beholder, but a lot of it comes down to sort of the culture almost of each of these amendments, right? You know, the Fourth Amendment, we get all these facts and things shift, and every term there's 3 new cases that I'll have to teach in criminal procedure because stuff changes so quickly. Whereas in the First Amendment context, I think we like to conceptualize it as these are fundamental, the doctrine is a result of fundamental principle that can't be shifted.
Okay, the short answer is no and yes, which they contradict each other, but I'll try to explain. At least in the context of legal scholarship and the law, I would like us to get away from discussing terrorism as an exception, especially when it comes to judicially created tests. And I think of Dennis, for example, versus United States as a case that has actually not technically been overruled, but it is the national security exception to Brandenburg, right? And you see people hearken back to it when they kind of try to justify why we should change Brandenburg. And they sort of say, well, you know, it's still there, so we can go back to it, right? And so if you use terrorism and terrorism as some sort of exceptional thing, as yet another sort of aspect of that to change what I think are supposed to be sort of neutral, judicially crafted rules, that's a problem. Using unpopular groups, and I realize that terrorism is more than that, but it's such a malleable concept that it can broaden out to that as a reason to change judicial doctrine, I think is really, really a problem. So I would like to jettison that discussion and talk about what we think of as Brandenburg and its issues much more in the context of what I think Professor Healy, oops, sorry, I hope I didn't, has written about, it's Notre Dame, right, your Notre Dame article, in the context of let's give some meaning to what we mean by imminence. Let's talk about the evidentiary requirements and the causation requirements. And there are a lot of unanswered questions about Brandenburg that I think we could really help give guide to judges in terms of the context that's needed there. And we don't need to talk about exceptional groups or exceptional cases in order to do that. I think in the world, though, terrorism it's really got a stranglehold on us in ways that I think we need to discuss. But there's so many unconscious biases there, right? Again, this goes back to Caroline Corbin's article about terrorists are always black and brown and never white. We need to discuss the fact that actually when they do polls in the US, people are much more worried about sort of some of the violence associated with school shootings and synagogue shootings and shootings at health clinics than they are about international terrorism in the United States. And so we have to start thinking about how we talk about violence. Again, maybe getting away from labels, but educating people as to what really the sources of violence are, how they happen when they occur, to give depth to that so that we can get away from some of the stereotypes and prejudices there, at least try to give depth to that notion.
Well, we've come to the end of our time. I want to thank all the panelists for this terrific presentation. And we reconvene at 3 o'clock for the final panel, which will answer all questions and resolve all issues.
Welcome to the last panel, last waltz, as it were. I'm Ron Collins, Nadine Strawson, Michael Seidman, and the words agent provocateur came up earlier. If you were looking for 2 great agent provocateurs, you have them in Nadine and Michael. And so I'm going to hope that they live up to their reputations, at least the ones that I've assigned to the John Marshall Harlan Professor of Law at New York Law School, Nadine Strawson, and Michael Goldman, the Carmack Waterhouse Professor of Constitutional Law at Georgetown. And their writings, whether or not they be on hate or whether or not progressives can support free speech, have provoked many and opened many minds. And at the end of the day, isn't that what the First Amendment should be all about? And if we believe firmly in uninhibited, robust, and wide-open discussion, then such discussion has to apply as well to the First Amendment. And so in that spirit, we'll try to bring some of that ethos to you today. I warn my colleagues, my friends, my fellow progressives, and I guess we're all progressives. Are we all liberals as well? Well, 2.5. Well, I didn't even bring in libertarian. You know, so these days when you support free speech or the stand you have on free speech is very complicated. Are you liberal? Are you libertarian? Are you conservative? Are you none of the above? Maybe that's the way it is meant to be.
I like the term libertarian. Thank you.
Okay. Your turn. You're okay with that?
No, that's for me.
No, I know.
I'm a Sidemanian. That's my position.
Touche.
All right. So in our exchange today, just two admonitions to my friends, however they bill themselves. Evasive answers are impermissible. Okay. So this is not a White House press conference. You can't do that. And no filibustering. So you cannot act as if you're a United States senator and you're asked a question on Fox News or MSNBC or whatever it is you watch. So with that, let me begin our discussion. You know, as I listened to the exchanges today about Brandenburg, apart from Leslie's, I thought, very important clip that she showed, there wasn't really much discussion, if any, about the whole question of how does race factor in? How does the principle of equality factor in when we're discussing the First Amendment? Is there no role about it? Did Kenneth Karst not write something years ago in the Chicago Law Review about equality and its relationship to the First Amendment? Or when recently Catherine McKinnon in an essay said, you know, the problem with a lot of First Amendment jurisprudence, including Brandenburg, is that the principle of equality is virtually absent from that. I'm just curious, Michael, let me start with you, and then I'll go to Nadine. What are your views on that?
So I think of myself as a free speech pragmatist. So I think free speech issues, including issues about equality, are essentially policy issues. It's not, asking a free speech issue is not different from asking whether nuclear power ought to be a part of the fight against global warming or how we ought to deliver health care. And those are issues that are important, and they are value-laden, but they're also issues that are appropriately subject to democratic contestation, and that different people can reasonably have different views about, and that are largely about consequences rather than high principles. So in terms of balancing equality and free speech, I think it's a real problem. But the one thing that seems obvious to me is that it's not a problem that can be resolved for all time and all places. It is, in the end, as David said, a pragmatic question.
Did your former boss, Thurgood Marshall, get it right in Brandenburg versus Ohio when he signed on to that opinion?
My former boss always got it right. But no, I don't think these are issues about constitutional principle, and in particular, I think the American free speech tradition is a really terrible way of trying to resolve these issues. So just to give a very simple example.
Yeah, we want to get to Nadine. You're
okay, I'm going to say this will be. I know you're not.
No, he's not.
I know you're not supposed to.
Equal time.
Okay. All right. Okay. All right.
When you say don't filibuster, you're forgetting who you're dealing with, right? So look, just a very, very quick, very simple example. Suppose Mark Zuckerberg wakes up this morning and he says, you know, I think Donald Trump is right. Actually, the Democrats are treasonous. He has this epiphany. And then he says, so I'm just not going to let anybody who's a Democrat use Facebook. Now, the first point is, under conventional First Amendment doctrine, the free speech clause doesn't apply to prevent him in any way from doing that, even though it would have a massive effect on free speech. And the second point is, actually, for the government to try to intervene to prevent him from doing that, that would be a free speech problem. That seems to me to raise real questions about whether this is the right way to approach any public policy issue.
I couldn't agree more with Mike and with Jonathan about the terrific new challenges and conundrums we face in areas that right now are not governed by the First Amendment, at least as far as our free speech rights are concerned. On the basic issue, though, freedom of speech and equality, I continue to believe, based on evidence and experience in both this country and others, that the two of them are mutually reinforcing. I do think this is an empirical, practical question, and even though I always tell my students you should never make policy arguments, you have to make constitutional law arguments, the truth is that even under strict scrutiny, policy arguments are relevant, right? If you can show evidence that a certain speech restriction is necessary to promote a goal of compelling importance, which equality certainly is, then even under strict scrutiny, you would have to support that restriction. And based on the research I did for my book that came out last year, so the research was current as of 2017, but I continue to follow it, I am convinced, and more importantly, human rights activists all over the world and in international human rights organizations are convinced, based on the experience with their hate speech laws in their countries, that no matter how well intended they are to promote equality, they actually do more harm than good. And you made me think, Mike, of many, many, many years ago, I did a debate on this topic and also on pornography against Stanley Fish, who was very much on the other side. Mark Tushnet was the moderator. And Mark said, I think that, here was the verdict that he gave. He said, Stanley wins on philosophy, Nadine wins on politics, and because I think politics is more important than philosophy, Nadine wins. And I've made the same argument about pornography in response to the McDworkinites.
So I think one of the great strengths of Nadine's terrific book is that it's almost all about policy.
And can we have Nadine give the title?
Hate. Why we should resist it with free speech, not censorship.
So and on many of the policy issues, Nadine, I agree with you, and I think that's the way we ought to talk about it, not in terms of doctrine or the Constitution, but I do just want to give another sort of hypo about how I think there is a real tension between equality and free speech. So let's just imagine for a moment some very rich person buys a huge advertisement in Times Square with flashing lights on private property. And in gigantic letters it says, rape is good, okay? So I take it under incitement doctrine, you'd have to show some immediacy or imminence, and that might be very hard to show. Or suppose instead there's no words at all, just a gigantic flashing swastika on Times Square. Whether that incites or not, that's going to be a problem for people who want to be in Times Square. And I think that's a legitimate concern that ought to permit government to regulate something like that.
Nadine?
I just distrust government as regulator much more than I distrust my fellow citizens to mobilize with effective counter-speech. Because we already heard examples from my ACLU colleague Emerson Sykes, for example, of Black Lives Matter activism and symbols has been denounced as hate speech. And this has been true in high schools around the country where students have been forced to remove T-shirts with those symbols. So, and just as I learned from the research for my book that censorship is even less effective and more counterproductive than I had realized. On the positive side, I really saw so much evidence that counter speech and other non-sensorial tactics are even more effective than I thought they would be. And there's a lot of social science psychologists and neuroscientists and others who attest to the great power that we have. They're not just words, right? Just the fact that there can be harm from being, and trauma from being subjected to these racist symbols. Well, counter speech can really counteract that harm. And I'm very encouraged that there are a lot of experts who are honing their skills and their knowledge to help all of us to make much more effective use, not only reactively, but proactively. Because social science shows that, you know, if we create communities proactively, including on campus, that are truly inclusive and making everybody feel equal and respected and belonging, then the power of a hate monger through a flashing swastika, the power to do any harm, is greatly, greatly reduced.
Well, I don't know how much you want to.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay, so I distrust government also. I distrust government making the right decision about whether nuclear power ought to be part of a global warming policy. I distrust government for very good reason about how they are going to organize healthcare. But as a progressive, as a general matter, I don't think that we should just assume that private markets are going to produce the right outcome with regard to global warming or with regard to health care. I think sometimes government is necessary to correct, to put it bluntly, the exorbitant power that rich people have. And if I'm a really rich person and I can buy a huge thing in Times Square, it's flashing a swastika, I don't know that we can depend on people on the other side to have enough money to buy something else, and I don't know what they would buy that would correct the problem.
May I say something? Because I've said counter speech and other non-sensorial measures because we have a lot of low-hanging fruit in this society. We have an incomplete set of anti-discrimination laws, right? In most of this country, it's still completely legal to refuse to hire somebody or fire somebody because of sexual orientation or gender identity. We know about the systemic and structural racial discrimination and bias that's built into the criminal justice system. I think there was a little bit of mention of this today that since 9/11, law enforcement at every single level of government has systematically failed to investigate and prosecute white supremacists, white nationalists, and other domestic extremists. So you have you know, what happened in Charlottesville in that sense was not an aberration. And I really get frustrated about going after symbols, powerful and horrible as they are, especially to the daughter of a Holocaust survivor. But I think it's too much of a distraction from doing the really, really hard work of attacking actual discrimination that is structural and to some extent even legally permitted.
You know, you two don't need me to engage each other. They're doing fine on their own. So I'm, Michael, two questions, because some of the ones I was going to ask Nadine, you've already asked, and so we'll continue. But first of all, I can't recall what your answer was to whether or not you thought Brandenburg versus Ohio was rightly decided.
I think it's wrongly decided because I don't think that we ought to decide these issues I don't think they ought to be decided by judges. I don't think they ought to be decided as matters of eternal constitutional principle. I think they are policy questions that are appropriately subject to democratic contestation.
So the follow-up question, you'll have a reply on that. So sometimes you said you're in favor of government regulation and sometimes not. The president has just issued an executive order having to do with colleges and enhancing, if you will, First Amendment freedoms. What's your progressive take on that?
So I think it's really interesting how everybody has shifted sides on this question. So I took the conservative position to be that we are free when there is no government, that what makes us free is just the ability to participate in markets. So I would have thought the conservative position was, gee, if your college is not promoting the free speech regime you would like, go to another college. Instead, thank God, conservatives are finally recognizing sometimes government regulation makes us free. It's not so easy to go to another college. And so, in principle, I'm all in favor of governments regulating universities and preventing private actors from restricting free speech. I think the problem I have with the regulation is I'm afraid that there is some sort of rigid constitutionalized idea about what free speech is that's going to be enforced, and for the reasons I've already given, I'm opposed to that.
I share a fear, but it's a slightly different one, that there's such a malleable, subjective, discretionary standard that what is seen as a violation of free speech can very much be in the eye of the beholder. And I don't know if you consider I'm a conservative or not, but I testified before the Senate Judiciary Education Committee about a year ago and a half ago, chaired by Senator Lamar Alexander, a Republican and former president of a major university and former education secretary, which could well have informed his view. But he, as well as Patty Murray, the liberal Democrat who was the ranking member, opposed. At that point, there was no sign of a potential executive order, but there were proposals for federal legislation or state legislation, ostensibly to protect free speech on campus. And they were both opposed to that and much more willing to trust universities for all of their imperfections, with their commitment to and their experience with academic freedom and free speech. And I'm very concerned about, the judgments that are involved in the many situations we see on campus with protesters and counter-protesters. I strongly defend the right to vigorous counter-protest, but what I might see as therefore a protected exercise of free speech, a government agency might well see that as crossing the line to actually violating the free speech rights of the speaker and audience. And especially given the discretion, it leaves so much opportunity to selectively enforce it or to be influenced even subconsciously by the speech involved, by the message involved. And my interpretation, and it's not unique, is that this is what happened at the University of Arizona a couple of weeks ago, a university which had earned a rare green light from FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, showing that it had and enforced positive free speech protections. And you can watch the video of students who were protesting outside a classroom where Border Patrol agents were speaking to a student group, a criminal law group that had invited them. And you could, they weren't disrupted. The speaker was proceeding, the students were hearing the speaker, and they used very strongly critical terms, to be sure, but they were actually, 3 of the students who were demonstrating were arrested and charged with crimes. And I don't think that's a coincidence that they were espousing anti-Border Patrol perspectives, and it was in the wake of this executive order that was threatening the university with loss of research funds.
So, Nadine, just to illustrate, I think, the problems that progressives have with your position, let's just do a little thought experiment. Suppose we substitute for the words free speech, anti-discrimination. And then I'm just going to substitute them and repeat what you said. As between the government and private universities, sure, private universities make mistakes, but we can trust them better to enforce anti-discrimination law than the government. And when we have the government enforcing anti-discrimination law, gee whiz, look at what they do. They prohibit affirmative action. They do all kinds of bad things with regard to anti-discrimination law, and therefore we ought to leave the rights of women and minority students to the tender mercies of university administrators who are going to do a better job of it than the government. Now, I'm just guessing. I'll let you speak
On
in a minute.
affirmative action, I think I would take that position.
I'm just guessing that's not your position, that you believe in Title IX, that you believe in non-discrimination. Then I think, if I'm right about that, you have to explain why it is that you trust the government with regard to non-discrimination, but not with regard to speech.
Okay, well, so first of all, it's a little bit oversimplified insofar as the government still, of course, has a role when we're talking about public universities, though that is the government.
I'm talking about private universities.
Okay, so and we're still talking about a role for the government in terms of enforcing whatever the legal standard is, be it a First Amendment standard or be it a statutory standard. It's an excellent question, and I think that with respect to affirmative action policies, I agree. You know, it's the same kind of philosophy that persuaded the Supreme Court to say we are going to defer to the expertise of the university in deciding who is going to be admitted and what the criteria are, and therefore deferring in favor of affirmative action programs.
So the government should defer to a private university that decides in their expertise it's just better not to admit black students.
No, I'm saying when the question is a close question.
Yeah, but I mean, I think your position is like saying we should defer to the government when they're encouraging the right speech but not the wrong speech. If you're saying that your particular conception of racial justice includes affirmative action but doesn't include excluding people from a certain race, okay, that's your conception. My conception of the kind of speech that's valuable is speech that promotes left-wing causes but not right-wing causes, okay? So why is it that the government has to be neutral with regard to speech, but it's okay for it to adopt your particular conception of racial justice with regard to discrimination?
Well, see, there I think there's no comparison at all, because there is a new, equality in the realm of ideas. It turns out to be a different policy, right, than equality in the realm of who you are. Equality in the realm of who you are means no, they're the same. You cannot discriminate based on who a person is, and you cannot discriminate based on what they believe. That seems so, in some ways, we're circular going back to Ron's original question. Right.
Before you two get any more carried away, I'm going to have to leave here in a minute. You're doing great. So I wanted to just, first of all, if you think about the exchange you've just been listening to, the equality principle has come into the room yet again in a bold way. And it really shows why the progressive or liberal or whatever you call it mindset these days when it comes to free speech is really sometimes very schizophrenic. I want to ask you, Nadine, in terms of, we saw the clips from Charlottesville, what sort of regulations, knowing what we know, would you allow either after the fact or before the fact or during the fact?
Yeah, I've thought about this situation a lot. I read with great concern as soon as it came out the report that was commissioned by the city council there, and I agree with somebody made the point earlier that there was a complete failure of law enforcement. I mean, so the point is that there was a lot that could and should have been done under existing law, which was discussed very well in Leslie's compelling presentation. And it turns out that there was actually some local law that would have prevented people from marching with lighted torches or with firearms, and it just wasn't even known that they had that law, and I don't think the ACLU or others would have challenged that law. What I thought of when I had seen those images initially was that that they would satisfy when they were marching en masse with tiki torches that are lighted. To me, that satisfied the concept of a true threat. Now, I have to tell you, Jeff Stone and I have disagreed about that because he thought it wasn't targeted enough, but I thought seeing it again, especially with the students who were surrounded, how is that not targeted enough to meaningfully instill a reasonable fear on an objective standard that you're going to be subject to violence? I certainly would have been deterred from exercising my free speech rights of counter-protest by that display. And it was just absolutely shocking the extent to which there was an absence of preparation, communication, coordination, and even mere physical presence. Of course, the whole area where Heather Heyer and others were mowed down, there was literally not a single law enforcement officer on duty in a whole large area.
As I recall, and I don't think Leslie is here, so
She had to leave.
So I may be speaking out of turn, but as I recall something she said during launch, she said that this deference, if you will, or hesitation by police is precisely because of Brandenburg. That Brandenburg causes that kind of, if you will, police deference or backing away or hesitance to do anything. How would you respond to that?
Well, that's a hypothesis. I would really be interested in examining it. There's another hypothesis that's been thrown out, and again, I'm not saying, I haven't examined enough evidence to know whether it's worthy of belief or not, but that there was some racial motivation on the part of at least some of the law enforcement agencies of being ideologically sympathetic to the alt-right demonstrators.
So I think there are pragmatic arguments in favor of not suppressing speech, even hateful speech. So I take the point that sometimes hate speech generates counter speech, and sometimes that's a good thing. I take the point that trying to suppress hate speech may just drive it underground, and where it might be even more dangerous. Those are pragmatic arguments I understand. There are also pragmatic arguments on the other side, and so we have to balance and think about which
Who's the we?
I think, as I say, I think this is a matter of democratic contestation. It's not...
You're sounding a lot like Felix Frankfurter.
I'm sounding a lot like Felix. There you go.
Not a great defender of the First Amendment.
So I don't think that... I think these questions are context-specific. They are temporally specific. So one thing you said, Nadine, that just really surprises me, and I just could not disagree more. You said...
Don't be shy.
You said all ideas are created equal. Well, no, they're not. So if you have some people saying...
I didn't say that, actually. I
those were
said
your
government has to remain neutral toward ideas.
Well, no,
as
it
a basic-
doesn't. Because, and the reason it doesn't is because all ideas are not equal. So if you have some people yelling, Jews must go, and other people saying equality for all people, first of all, those ideas are not created equal. The first one is hateful and awful and an idea people ought not to have. And the second one is an idea people ought to have. And if the government is acting to counter the first idea and promote the second, gee whiz, that's the kind of government that I would support.
But if I may say so, Michael, the first part of what you said is inconsistent with the second part of what you said, because I agree with you. I want to drive certain ideas out of people's minds. I don't want them to accept those ideas, but I reject your conclusion that the way to achieve that goal is through government suppression for
now,
some of the reasons that you started
so
by
now,
saying it's just going to drive them underground. It's going to make people less susceptible. And let me tell you, one of the things that I learned in the ongoing research about how do we resist hate, because that really is the main title of my book, and I'm examining what's the most effective way to do that. I, like most of the people here, think of counter speech as advocacy about ideas, debate about ideas on a broad scale. I've become much more persuaded as a result. Among other things I've been reading are narratives from hate mongers, former hate mongers, people who have interceded with them to wean them away, or they often use the term redeem them from their hateful groups. And so often it is not a matter of ideology coming first. These are people who have all kinds of psychological and social problems. They've been abandoned by they have dysfunctional families, they get kicked out of school, and they are ripe fruit for recruiting for some bonding experience by hate mongers, and then the ideology comes second. So the way to wean them away in many of these cases is not by persuading them that their ideas are wrong, it's by reaching out to them with compassion. And so to me, that's much more effective than treating somebody as a criminal, which
given what you've said, how do you account for the Southern Poverty Law Center has said that we've witnessed in the last few years a dramatic increase in hate crimes. How do you account for that? Is that not at all related to speech?
First of all, we have too many hate crimes, so whether there are more than there used to be or whether there's more reporting is beside the point. But I do have to say it's really not demonstrable that there are more, but it is demonstrable that there are too many. And the law does have the power to prosecute crimes, actual crimes that are crimes independent of the idea or the expression that's associated with it, and that should be done. As a matter of First Amendment law, I support the notion of enhanced penalties on the theory that crimes where a victim is singled out for a discriminatory reason cause more harm to the individual, to the community to which that person belongs, and to society as a whole. However, and when the ACLU adopted the position rejecting a potential First Amendment challenge to hate crimes, we did say we are going to monitor how these laws are actually enforced, because we are really concerned that they might well be enforced the way so many laws are enforced, in a way that's disproportionate against members of minority groups. Just yesterday, I heard a story on WNYC, the local NPR affiliate. The FBI's completely imperfect and incomplete hate crime statistics showed that last year, 21% of hate crimes were ostensibly committed by members of minority groups. Much higher percentage than they constitute of the population as a whole. So that suggests to me that this is becoming yet another tool of the criminal justice system to disproportionately punish members of minority groups.
Michael?
Thanks, Ron. So I really admire the way Nadine just put the question. It's the way I would put the question. So what she's asking is, all things considered, what's the most effective way of countering hate speech and intolerance? And I think that's exactly the right way to ask the question. So, and she might even be right about what the most effective way is. But here's the point. That is not different from asking a question about what is the most effective way to stop global warming, and is nuclear power an effective way of ending global warming? In other words, it's a question about empirics. Mm-hmm. It's a question about facts in the world, and because it's a question about facts in the world, it's not a question of high principle, and it's not. The facts might be one way at one time, another way at another time. It might be the facts are true in some circumstances, but not in others. It's not the kind of thing that we ought to say is part of the Constitution, or we ought to say judges have a special role in deciding. We ought to be open-minded and skeptical about it, and we ought to look at what the evidence is and act based on the evidence. And again, the evidence might well be on your side. I thought your book was very persuasive on the evidence, but I could imagine, for example, that the evidence is one way in New York and another way in Iowa, right? And if that's true, we ought to have one regime in New York and another regime in Iowa.
Well, 2 points, Michael. Number one, there are matters of high principle insofar as what we are talking about is liberty and justice for all.
And we're talking about the future of the planet when we're talking about global warming and those are matters of high principle also.
But in terms of the overall analytical framework, why do we say that we will presume freedom of speech is protected unless or until the restriction is necessary to promote a goal of countervailing, compelling importance? And by the way, equality is such a goal. Those are principles that we put such a high value on freedom of speech and on equality.
Michael, did I understand you correctly that you believe in the balkanization of the First Amendment? That is, First Amendment law in one state or one county and First Amendment law in another state, another county?
Well,
that reminded me of Justice Harlan, was the position he took in an obscenity case.
Yeah.
I don't think we ought to think about free speech in terms of the First Amendment. I think the
Well,
fundamental
do you believe in the
mistake
balkanization of free speech?
I think the fundamental mistake here is constitutionalizing what is a legitimate policy question. And like other legitimate policy questions, I think sometimes a one-size-fits-all thing works. So I don't think it makes sense to deal with global warming by without the federal government and indeed without international law playing a role. But sometimes situations are different in different places, and they're decentralized.
So your answer would be yes.
May I?
I am
County.
open-minded and agnostic about that.
Okay,
I
you're
think
being
as with
evasive.
everything else,
All
it
right,
depends
Nadine.
on the facts.
And I'm going to put out a premise here, which I'm, in theory, open to counter evidence, but it seems to me that one can predict that equality is going to be undermined by government power to regulate on any standard that's looser than something like the Brandenburg Standard or very tightly constraining government discretion, that one can predict that the government, which is accountable to the majority or powerful private sector interests, moneyed interests, predictably is going to exercise its discretion in a way that is not friendly to the equal rights, including the equal free speech rights of minority groups, whether they be demographic minorities or whether they be ideological minorities.
Nadine, what's so puzzling about your position is that is precisely the view that libertarians take with regard to the redistribution of property. So a libertarian would say, gee, it would be great if the government redistributed property in a just way, but I can predict that what's going to happen is if the government can touch property, they're going to give rich people more property and poor people less property. And you know what? There is some empirical basis for that. Just look at the Trump tax cuts. But I had thought the view of progressives was that as difficult as it is to get a decent government is all that stands between us and unfettered markets, and unfettered markets are worse.
Yeah.
So I think the challenge for you is
Yeah.
Why do you think that unfettered markets with regard to property are worse than government regulation, but somehow unfettered markets with regard to speech are just magically going to produce justice, especially given the fact that speech opportunities are directly connected to property?
Right, and I'm not saying will produce justice, but I'm saying less likely to predictably produce injustice. And
But you don't
you're
think that with regard
you're
to
absolutely.
property
I mean,
distribution.
first of all, I haven't thought about that as much, except I regularly get into these arguments with my libertarian friends at the Cato Institute and the ACL, so they see the ACLU as being impure because not only do we not resist all government regulation. We have affirmatively championed certain government regulation, specifically civil rights and anti-discrimination laws. So you make a really, really important point, Mike, which is I have to be very careful in my criticism of the government and talking about being distrustful of the government, not to go too far, right? Just the way today when we criticize something that's said in the media, I feel it necessary to say, but I don't think the media are the enemy of the people. And I think there is so much anti-government rhetoric that I do want to correct that and say, yes, I will make a judgment on a case-by-case basis as to whether government will do less harm or actually can be an engine to promote even civil libertarian goals of liberty and justice for all.
So one more question, and I'm going to pose to them, and then we're going to turn it to you. So please, if you can, make your questions provocative. Nothing tame, no softballs. So one of the things we've been talking about incitement, one of the, if you will, secondary effects, if I can put it, of incitement. And when I was at the University of Washington, we had a very controversial speaker there speak, and the university had to spend an enormous amount of money for security. So, 10 speakers a year will pretty much bankrupt the university. Nadine, Michael, these are policy questions. How much money does the university have to lay out? How many controversial speakers do they have to allow before they just say we can't afford it anymore?
Do you want to start?
So I don't know exactly how, I would say $4,625.36. No, I don't know exactly how much money, but one thing I'm confident.
Would you charge the speakers?
One thing I'm confident of, it's not all the money in the world. And I don't think universities should be obligated to exhaust their budgets on this. There are other things that are important and sometimes more important.
And I think there are steps that can be content-neutral steps that can be, or viewpoint-neutral steps that can be taken to reduce the security costs, including some universities I was really surprised to learn. I think they were surprised to learn that they had completely open forum policies that literally anybody could come without even being invited by a member of the community. Auburn, for example, was in that position. I suspect that they were doing it because it used to be a money-making opportunity, right, through rental fees, and then when it became exactly the opposite, they changed their policies, and I have no problem with that. Or to, so you could limit the speakers to those who have some connection to the community. You could limit the spaces where the speech is going to take place so that it be a place where security could be provided relatively easily and relatively inexpensively. But I agree, I would much rather have enough money to provide financial aid so that more people, non-wealthy people whose parents can't buy their way in can have the opportunity.
All right, now, ladies and gentlemen, it's your opportunity, so don't all raise your hands at once.
I want to pick up the question about equality versus free speech, because it does seem a little bit in the discussion as if they were being unnecessarily opposed. Mm-hmm. And it also seemed like the cases, incitement of the 100 Abrams and the early sedition and Espionage Act cases were not being remembered enough. So when we talked about those cases earlier today, there's a way you can think about those cases as liberty cases. We're just going to protect the individual right to say whatever they want to say, even if it's horrible. But I think they are better understood as equality cases, where the court was really worried at that point about systemic discrimination against ideological minorities, in that case communists and socialists, and about the government using its coercive power to undermine the vibrancy of the democratic system by using very, very onerous criminal sanctions to make it extremely difficult for radical groups to express radical messages that the government thought was destabilizing to its own power. That's an equality message and a democracy message as much as, if not more, than it's about individual autonomy. And so I guess I wanted to ask about this sort of the fight between liberty and equality. Progressives like the government. Sometimes they don't like the government. Sometimes are they just simply being incoherent? Well, the dominant narrative, the ideological justification that has, I think progressives or those on the left have clung to over the last 70 years is the model of representation reinforcement, that the government has a role to play, and courts in particular have a role to play when the democratic political processes are not working properly to represent the interests of all members of the community, but otherwise, stay out of the system. That's why, we think property rights can be adjudicated through democratic means, but speech rights, because it's so core to the democratic process, need judicial supervision. Have we given up? Am I hearing, especially from Mike, have we given up on representation reinforcement in this area?
So sometimes there's a tension between speech rights and equality. Sometimes the two reinforce each other. As with everything else, it all depends. What I do want to just reject out of hand is what I take to be the ideological presupposition of our free speech regime, which is that when Congress makes no laws, therefore things are free and equal. There's just no reason to think that. Sometimes when Congress makes no laws, therefore people are compelled, and it's not equal. Because markets, this is the fundamental progressive faith, markets don't automatically produce either liberty or equality. And where that is true, government has a legitimate role to play through regulation, including regulation of speech opportunities, so as to provide authentic liberty and equality.
I would just add, thank you for that perspective, which I really share. You had asked about Thurgood Marshall. He wrote, to the best of my knowledge, the only case that most of us think of as a free speech case that was explicitly based on the Equal Protection Clause, not the Free Speech Clause. The Mosley case, and in which it happened that the person who was being suppressed was an African American who was protesting against racial exclusion in a public school. That sounds a little bit familiar here in New York. And he, I think as an afterthought, he said, the First Amendment could also protect the speaker here. Where there's a positive role for government, and I do mention it in my book, is to facilitate the educational and technological and other resources so that all members of our society can equally avail themselves of opportunities to communicate effectively, including counter speech. So I certainly see a positive role for government in that regard.
Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Hello. Just want to thank you guys both for coming. I just have a question. It's basically the same question for both of you, despite different views. From hearing from both arguments, in my mind, you both have not an issue, but a majority problem where you have government being controlled in our democratic system. They're a majority, so the regulation would be what the majority views needs to be regulated, versus also counter speech, where a majority counter speech can drown out any type of minority. So I just want to know how you both would respond to that.
It's a very difficult issue, which I was talking about with a number of people here beforehand, including Thomas Healy. I defend counter speech, right? Precise, and I exhort people to engage in it precisely because I do want to suppress certain views, and I'd rather have them suppressed through counter speech and persuasion and convincing and redeeming than by government suppression. I think that's more effective. But there is absolutely no doubt that counter speech can have a coercive impact at a certain point. I was reminded that the famous essay on liberty actually is focusing on the suppressive impact not of coercive government measures, but rather of peer pressure and social pressure. That was seen as for all practical purposes, having a more significant impact. And that we hear from reports on campus, that there's, to some extent, some campuses are enforcing disciplinary rules, but the more pervasive problem is the self-censorship that both professors and students are feeling. Now, if the self-censorship is that they're not making insensitive racist statements, my heart is not broken. But if the self-censorship is, as by accounts it is, that they're not daring to discuss and ask sincere questions about, very important topics such as immigration policy and sexual violence and so forth, I'm very concerned about it. So it's a very, very difficult, delicate issue.
Michael?
So one of the concerns I have about free speech law and about constitutional law generally, which we haven't talked about, is what I would refer to as an obsession with protecting minority rights. Now, I don't want to be misunderstood about this. There is a danger, an obvious danger, in running roughshod over minorities and not respecting their rights. But if you want to talk about what is the serious problem in the United States today, I actually think the problem is protecting majority rights and protecting majorities against minorities. So on issue after issue, on the regulation of guns, on tax policy, on health care, our government is not doing what a majority of Americans want. And indeed, the President of the United States is someone who a majority of Americans rejected. So to me, what is the if you will, the clear and present danger is the seizure of governmental power by a minority that needs to be dislodged by a mobilized and awakened majority.
Other questions? Yes, sir.
Two quick comments. Regarding free speech as a policy issue, can't you argue that most constitutional principles and issues are policy-oriented in character, and that therefore, if you're going to throw out free speech from having judges examine them and base their decisions on the principles that we've inherited for the last 100 years, that you might as well do that with all constitutional law? And the second comment is one that Nadine just brought up about freedom of speech as a cultural ideal. And I was interested to hear you say that you wanted to persuade, countermeasures to persuade people, sort of sense they all agree with you, right? And to what extent is that consistent with John Stuart Mill's notion of freedom of speech as that we have to avoid this kind of homogeneity, this homogeneous culture, and that the biggest problem that we have culturally speaking, freedom of speech as a cultural ideal, is that we're losing that. And if we lose that, is there any chance that the constitutional right of free speech can survive?
So with regard to your first point, I'm now going to lose the little bit of credibility that I have left in the room, I'm afraid. But the trouble with reductio ad absurdums is that if the person's willing to be absurd, then the argument doesn't work. And actually, my position is that, yes, free speech is just like the rest of the Constitution, and for that reason, across the range of constitutional rights, constitutional law is the wrong way to think about these problems. And we ought to give up on the idea that somehow we can settle disputes that divide Americans today based on ideas that people had 250 years ago that are people who lived in a radically different country, and by the way, thought that women ought to have no role in politics and that other human beings could be owned. It seems just very nuts to me to think that that's the way we ought to decide things today. This is, after all, our country. It's not their country. They're dead. We're alive, and we have the right to have the kind of country that we want to live in, not the kind of country that they wanted us to live in.
I really can't add anything more to what I said before. I think that this is a conundrum. If people have ideas, I certainly want to be able to hear them. There are some ideas that I think it would be nice if nobody had them anymore, such as we are not all created equal. And I think maybe the word to use there is ideals. It would be wonderful if we were all committed to those ideals. That said, we would still have radically different views about how to achieve those ideals. And I don't think there's, quite frankly, any realistic danger that we're going to suppress debate.
We have time for one last question, if anybody has a question. Yeah, Bill?
Yeah, so Nadine, I want to return to your answer to Jacqueline's
Yeah.
question. Because maybe I misunderstood. Because maybe I misunderstood your answer. I'd like you to address the concept of shaming, essentially,
Yeah.
and informal, non-governmental
Yeah.
coercion
Yeah.
to literally shut
Yeah.
people up.
Yeah.
Because it sounded like, from your response to Jacqueline's question, that you were that the only way you'd like to see, quote unquote, bad ideas driven out is through persuasion and through reason. And so I'm curious whether I heard you right, or whether instead you would be content, not as a doctrinal matter obviously, but as a general matter, whether you'd be content with those ideas being driven out of circulation because a majority simply thinks they're so vile that the adherents simply don't dare to utter the idea.
Yeah. I'm very torn about this. So this is the last 3 comments that I've had. I very strongly advocate counter speech, including by people in positions of power. It was another disagreement I had with my editor, Jeffrey Stone, who believes that university presidents, for example, should not denounce hateful speech. I think that they should, even recognizing that there could be, denouncing the ideas while defending the right to express them. I do recognize that there can be a very dramatic suppressive impact when you have somebody in that position of power using it to denounce certain ideas. You know, I used the model of Derek Bach at Harvard, who I thought had a very good way of expressing it. He said, I'm not going to punish these ideas, and we defend your free speech rights to express them and to adhere to them, but let me tell you, these ideas are inconsistent with the university values. You use the example of shaming. That to me is, and let me say this, I think it is a matter of strategy. What is the most, in part, what is the most effective way of persuading somebody to abandon hateful ideas? Here I'm very attracted to the whole concept of education and restorative justice. And I've read enough accounts of even leaders of hate-monger organizations being won over, and it's never through criminal punishment or discipline or shaming or ostracizing. It is through sympathetic, empathetic, compassionate outreach. So, I would support it if it worked, shaming, but in the end, I think we should, it's not likely to be as effective as other uses of our counter speech.
It is a grand day in the world of the First Amendment when people come together, when they exchange ideas, when they allow dissident views to be expressed, and they do so with a good measure of civility. By that measure, we owe the folks at this law school a great debt of gratitude. So first of all, thank you. And second of all, thank you, Michael, and thank you, Nadine, for what was really a very engaging moment. We appreciate it.
Thank you. You were terrific. I haven't thought about
So I'm not going to add anything more to what Ron said and Mike and Nadine and everyone else today, except to thank all of the speakers for their really marvelous presentations. Thank all of you for your attendance and for your contributions to the conversation. Obviously, the conversation continues, and I'm so honored that this law school was able to play a small part in that conversation. Thank you all so much. If you're traveling back, travel safely, and thank you again.